Dear Generation X, if you haven't already, you can stop crying now. This is MultimediaJay radio style for Saturday, November 30th, 2019. Let's start the show.
MultimediaJay radio style.
Ladies and gentlemen, a little disclaimer before we get into today's discussion. If you don't know a lot about the 90s, you might be a little lost, because we're talking about Generation X and the 90s today, and there will be some 90s references. So you may want to catch up on that decade, or don't. I really don't care if you blow off the 90s completely, because I don't think the 90s have a lot of stuff that's worth holding on to. Spoiler alert! But anyways, there will be some 90s references in this discussion, beginning with this one. It seems like I've turned these podcasts into an early Festivus observance. If you ever seen the Seinfeld episode, oh, a 90s reference, woo! Part of Festivus was airing your grievances at some family get-together. And Festivus for the rest of us was some kind of alternative holiday to Christmas and stuff like that. But we're talking about it around Thanksgiving, Black Friday instead. But anyways, the whole airing grievances thing. I suppose while we're on this whole topic, as much as I can say what I say about baby boomers, and as much as boomer versus millennial is the fad generational showdown on the internet, that's not to say that Generation X is completely innocent little angels here. Matter of fact, most hardcore Gen Xers I've known over the years would object to being called any kind of angel. Now, when it comes to problems I've dealt with throughout my life, and not just since it became popular for millennials and boomers to go back and forth at each other, Gen X takes the crown hands down. Oh, man. Another huge discussion I could have is my various grievances with Generation X, even though I'm not that far removed from it. So in a nutshell, my message to Generation X is, you can stop crying now. Now, let's get into some deep dive type stuff here. You see, some demographers out there would call folks born in the early 80s like myself, older millennials, Xennials, because, you know, there aren't enough labels out there for people in various age groups and stuff. But anyways, so apparently I could choose to cast my lot with Generation X, or I could cast my lot with the millennials, and it's clear that, you know, being pro-technology and not so angry and boo-hoo-hoo grunge stuff or whatever, I've cast my lot in with the millennials instead of Gen X. But there are some folks in my age group who are a lot more Gen X than millennial, let me tell you. So maybe the label does have some legitimacy to it. But this whole Xennial thing, I just don't know. Let's not even bother with that. I mean, I do embrace technology the way the millennials do. Maybe I should play catch up and have some avocado toast at some point, but the definition of millennials is early 80s to, I think, mid 2000s or something, early 80s to mid 90s. So that way you're old enough to have seen, you know, the year 2000, even if you were a little kid back then, and us move into the millennium, blah, blah, blah. So, but it hasn't always been this way. When I was growing up, I was lumped in with Generation X just because I was young. You know, when the millennials hadn't carved out their identity yet, everybody below a certain age was Gen X, and people were trying to cater to us the same way they tried to cater to the Gen X folks in the early to mid 90s. So when the late 90s rolled around, we still had the obnoxious, badass, bad attitude, fighting the man, counterculture, grunge-inspired rubbish still being used in advertisements. If you watch them nowadays, they're pretty cringy. You know, removed from that culture where everybody's having a bad day, everybody has an attitude problem, blah, 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 whatever. It's how do you look at this stuff nowadays and you're like, how did anybody ever get caught up in that stuff? But there are some people, sadly, in that generation that still are. I recall a meme that went around Facebook recently, aka old people social media, according to some people. But Tool got back together. Yeah, the band Tool got back together, and they did some shows and stuff, and there was this meme with this middle-aged guy. I don't know if he was 40 or whatnot, but this middle-aged guy in, like, office clothes running through the woods to the Tool concert, and it said Tool gets back together, every 40-year-old dude out there. Yeah, and I'm like, yeah, that is pretty spot on, because sadly, I know some Gen Xers who, despite being decades removed from being pimply-faced, misunderstood teenagers moping around in flannels about how they were going to be losers for the rest of their life, still hold on to this crap. They don't want to acknowledge that it was a fad, that young people were being spun in circles by marketers back in the 90s, like marketers like to do to young people. 18 to 34 is a very popular demographic. So the people heading towards 18 to 34, if you want to hook them while they're young, that's what you do. And you just, so much 90s stuff today. You look back at it with different eyes because we're long removed from that garbage, and you're like, how was any of this stomachable by the general public? Everything had to be extreme, and everybody had to be in a bad mood, and everybody, boo-hoo-hoo, I'm going to be a loser the rest of my life, even though I'm not. Just give me a break. And then there's the Generation X family pictures I've seen. Oh, look, a couple, they've been happily married for years. They have a house and kids, and they've done well for themselves. But the kids are dressed way better than the parents, because the parents are grown-up grunge kids who just can't let that stuff go. It might make me look old if I look like a normal person, even though I'm far removed from being that mopey teenager moping about in flannels about how I was going to be a loser the rest of my life. And I still listen to the music, and I still have the tongue barbell, and I still have the nose ring, and yeah, it's just, it's sad. You know, you see these pictures, the kids all look incredibly impeccably dressed, and then there's the parents, they're still got some kind of scruffiness to them, or some clothing that's not all that well ironed, or something like that. Just signs that they just can't let go of the decade-long bad attitude that was the 90s. Seriously? But yeah, as much as people like to go, boomers this, boomers that, Gen X isn't entirely innocent. And I suppose I should probably tell my story as to why I, despite growing up in the 90s, left that decade in the dust when the 2000s rolled around. So when I was little, I had the badass grunge sitters, you know, these bad girl sitters that wanted to make some extra money and whatnot, and they had their tongue ring and they snuck their boyfriend over or something along those lines, even though it's just, oh yeah, it's just this whole thing where decade-long bad attitude. Now, I realize a lot of it was a reaction to the hair bands in the 80s and stuff, but when you take that kind of stuff seriously for that long, shouldn't you just step back and take a look at yourself and, you know, what you're letting yourself be influenced by, and ask yourself, do you really want to be defined by this for the rest of your life? Or can you just grow out of it because you find out, oh, look, some marketers are just trying to market to young people, so everything had to have a bad attitude, everything had to be extreme, and everything had to be all boo-hoo-hoo and crap like that. It was a real wake-up call for me later in life to play a little catch-up on some Beavis and Butthead and stuff like that my folks were like, you're not watching that, it's not good for you, back when I was little. So I watch it later. And I'm like, oh, so that's why what's-his-name in school kept calling me a dumbass. Yeah, and it's just this 90s brain falling out of your head humor. Even the Office Space movie kind of counts as that. I mean, really? Come on. And, okay, let's get back to the story here. So yeah, I had the bad girl sitters when I was growing up, and the dysfunctional crybaby teen fads of the 90s had me thinking everybody between 13 and 19 was angry at their parents and not wanting to go to school and not wanting to make something of themselves. And yeah, it's just pathetic what fads can do to people, especially when you're too young to realize that fads often target young people to take advantage of their naivete and lack of life experience. Then I get into high school during the post-grunge era. Now, grunge was gone. There was still some grunge influence floating around out there, but some of the alt-rock bands at the time, and yeah, everything had to be alternative in the 90s, even when the alternative stuff became mainstream. Yeah. So I go off to have my, teenage experience after seeing all these grunge kids and whatnot, all trying to be badasses and stuff like that, and because I actually want to do something constructive with my life, do well in school, go to college, and become a productive citizen, I get made fun of for 4 years straight. No, seriously, I had no chance of being anybody in my high school days because of all of this crybaby, grunge-inspired, I'm going to be a loser for the rest of my life. Nobody understands me. Nobody knows the pain I'm going through. Yeah, whatever. Basically, for those of you who grew up in the 2000s, it was the gigantic forerunner to emo. Yeah, and I made fun of emo for the same reasons. Like, really? The kids are doing this again? Didn't we learn our lesson from a decade of this crap not too long ago? Yeah, that's another discussion entirely. This is about Gen X here, not about the millennials that got caught up in the emo fad. Grunge 2.0. I'll tell you, though, I may have been involved in an evangelical faith tradition with a youth group and stuff back then, but even the evangelical church that I was involved in and the youth group that I was involved in, the Christian rock we were listening to was inspired by some of the 90s stuff with the heavy guitars and things like that. There actually is this one group called Youth Alive from Australia. They're part of the Hillsong folks or whatever back then. You see the guy with the Kurt Cobain haircut sing about Jesus and stuff like that, and you're like, yeah, that's about as 90s as it gets, but at least it wasn't all boo-hoo-hoo, I'm a loser or something like that. And the thing is, some of the folks I was involved in that church group with were like, well, yeah, I mean, it's religious music, but at least it's not all boo-hoo-hoo like 2/3 of the stuff on the radio. You know, it's nice to listen to music and not end up in a bad mood 5 minutes later because it was the 90s. Woohoo! So, but I give the youth group credit, and I give the youth group a lot of credit because I had no chance of having any kind of a life as a teenager anywhere else. Not at home. I was out in the middle of the woods, not at school, getting picked on for actually having self-esteem. So the church was kind of the one place where I could actually have something resembling a normal adolescence and friends and all kinds of stuff because I had no chance anywhere else. All of this because of Generation X and how everything has to be marketed to Gen Xers, like everybody who's under the age of 20 is always in a bad mood all the time, blah, 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 attitudes, extreme, blah, blah, blah. Horrible, horrible, horrible stuff we were all caught up in. And here's the fun part, because high school doesn't last forever. Its drama always comes to an end, thank goodness. And guess what? All that non-stop getting made fun of because I actually dared to have somewhat of a positive attitude and some actual self-esteem and stuff like that. All of that crap that I went through 4 years straight. And then, a while after it all ends, social media becomes a thing. Folks are like, hey, remember so-and-so from school? Check out their profile. And so I see the digital online presences, as some people call them, of some of these people that were wrapped up in the crybaby fads of the 90s. They were going to be losers. I was a nerd for actually having self-esteem. They gave me all kinds of trouble when we were in school and stuff like that. And guess what? They didn't believe in jack squat. They got out of school, they threw off their teen fads, and they actually got constructive with their lives. They started trying to build up a life for themselves, and they may have gotten C's and D's in high school, but they found a way to get into a college, and then they worked hard to get straight A's. Oh, nice. Welcome to my world, finally, all you people who cast off that obnoxious 90s fad garbage. Yeah. There was one guy, I talk about, grunge kids moping about in flannels. There was one guy, he didn't take school seriously at all. He moped about in flannels. He shuffled about, didn't really care, didn't take anything too seriously. Snuck fishing worms into school one day, licked them and flicked them up to the ceiling to get them stuck in the drop ceiling tiles. Set a math teacher's dry erase markers on fire once. Did all kinds of stupid stuff. It's like, because, you're a misunderstood teenager. You're going to be a loser the rest of your life, blah, blah, blah. Then I find out that once we all got out of there, he went to college, got straight A's, got a job, worked his way into the management ranks, and then when I got out of college, he got back in contact with me, and he was trying to get me into his company. Here I was the guy that worked hard in school. He was the class clown. and yet he was the one trying to get me a job. So it wasn't the other way around. So, and that's what I've seen this too, mostly with millennials that are about my age or so, or maybe a little younger. Once the 90s crap was all said and done with, they actually moved on with things. And they made something of themselves, and they just cast all that crap off as a youthful indiscretion. Good on them. But there are Gen Xers out there who just kept on going. Kept on maintaining some aspect of having grown up in the 90s, kept the obnoxious tongue barbells or whatever, the piercings somewhere. Look, it's just weird to see grunge kid stuff on somebody with gray hair, or in the case of some of the getting up there in years grunge ladies who use hair dye, gray eyebrows. But I suppose if you're not being 100% prim and proper, that's part of what being Gen X is all about. But why not just go all in? I'm just curious, in the case of the aging grunge ladies, as it were, if they look back on pictures of them trying to look all bad girl and whatnot in the 90s, and they're like, you know, I really could have looked amazing if I wasn't caught up in this crap. Darn, I wish I could go back and do all that stuff over and actually look amazing for one point in my life. Now it's too late, but, you know, I often wonder about that. And especially, too, like when I'm looking through personal ads and I decide to check things off to where someone's at least several years older than me, and I see these single Gen Xers out there that just kept the look. They're like 45 years old and they still look like a grunge kid, but they have gray hair and stuff. Just really, I mean, and in the case of piercings and stuff, I'm not trying to be totally prude, old, fuddy-duddy or whatever. There's a practical element to that as well, because a lot of the work settings that I work in, dangling jewelry, including piercings and whatnot, can be dangerous if they snag on something and it rips out. So, you know, tape all the piercings, stuff like that, that sort of thing. It's a safety issue as well. It may have been like a fashion statement or a fight the power statement once upon a time, but it's not all that practical when you now have this snag point that could rip out if it gets caught on the wrong thing. So there's that element to it as well. It's not just about me not being a fan of crybaby 90s fads, although I certainly am not a fan of them, because look at what they've done. I mean, to some extent, I have to wonder if the Gen Xers that have just kept this going feel like they're a lost generation because they think what they did was stupid, but they kind of hold on to their youth by holding on to some of this stuff because they think it would make them look old if they ever abandoned it or something like that. It's a real mess, but I'm sure that's about as Gen X as it gets. You know, your head's a mess, you're all depressed about stuff, every day's a cloudy day, blah, blah, blah. Whatever, man. And as much as I have such a jaded history with this garbage, sadly, since getting into the whole narcissism thing and learning about malevolent personality types and people in life that aren't going to make any sense and whatnot, since getting into that stuff, I found out that when it comes to covert narcissism or vulnerable narcissism, the dark, brooding, moody narcissist who slinks in the shadows and gets all cloak and dagger with how they mess with other people because they feel like they're constantly getting held back by someone getting in their way and stuff along those lines. It's kind of sad that the way that I can easily describe covert narcissism is 90s crybaby fads on steroids. That's not to say the 90s were a completely lost decade either. I mean, we did have the Clinton years going on. We had incredible advances with video games and stuff like that. There was all kinds of music that went mainstream besides, you know, the grunge that was on all the rock stations and stuff like that. You know, there were all kinds of nice things that came out in the 90s. You know, computers as we know them today basically got hammered out in the 90s, and the ATX desktop standard that basically made the homebrew computer scene possible with standardized replaceable parts and industry standards for tower computers, that's straight out of 1995. And of course, GUI computing anywhere besides the Macintosh platform, Windows 95 and 98, even though it was blue, and it was the run-up to Windows Millennium Edition. But there's also Windows NT going on. There's Windows NT 5 that came out in the 90s. It was the forerunner to Windows 2000 XP and eventually leading to what we have today. There's lots of good things in the 90s that are worth remembering the 90s for. But the crybaby fads, why are they still a thing? Why are people still holding on to them? I would much rather see a reformed grunge kid toss all that stuff off and be like, yeah, you know, I was spun in circles and bamboozled by marketers when I was 15, but now that I'm 45 or so, you know what? Enough of that crap. I may look older for doing so, but at least I'm getting away from always being in a bad mood and looking like a hypocrite because I act like I'm some misunderstood teenager or look like I'm some misunderstood teenager in some ways when I've got a wife and kids and a career and I've, actually been successful. Gen X, you are more than welcome to leave those pathetic crybaby fads behind once and for all. As a millennial, I will not hold it against you. I'll be glad that finally something brought a smile to your face. Generation X, you are decades removed from the decade-long bad mood that was the 90s, even more so when we hit 2020 in a month or so. You can stop crying now, and I think the world will be very happy if you do. This is Multimedia J Radio Style. Don't touch that dial.